The Road to Revolution, 1763 through 1773. So we're going to go through those events right now. So we're going to talk about those sequence of things that happened. So this first one stretches over 10 years. It's going to cause them to rebel against one of the greatest empires that the world had ever seen at that point. So, if you were in class the other day, maybe we already went over this. The 1763 event is the Proclamation of 1763. So it is basically forbidding colonists to move west of the Appalachians. The British government said that that land was reserved for the Indians. So they proclaimed basically the Appalachians as the westernmost boundary for expansion of their British American colonists. We talked about this and we looked at it, so you can just sort of see over here. This is pretty much it. You can see it also in your book. I think it's page 133 that shows you that line. If you moved over that line, you were basically breaking the proclamation, and of course that was not good. So let's discuss colonist reaction to this. Well, the colonists were not happy, to say the least. They grew kind of alarmed and excited. They were a little fearful. They felt perhaps that some of their liberties were endangered by this new restriction. And now they start to distrust their mother country of England, the one that they had so much loved being part of this grand empire. So you're probably asking yourself, why does Great Britain pass it then? Why would they pass such a proclamation that they probably knew would anger their colonists in the colonies? Well, they didn't want any conflict with Indians. If you watch the video with John Green, he talks about an uprising known as Pontiac's War, Pontiac's Rebellion, and that raged up and down areas of Pennsylvania and New England, and it was a way that Indians tried to stop white movement. That would require them to send more troops in, and that would of course cost more money. So let's move on to the next event that happens in 1765. Okay, so that event is known as the Stamp Act. Okay, the Stamp Act. So what was it? Well, it's not about stamps. Okay, not the ones that you tend to think of today. The Stamp Act was pretty much a tax on all printed materials. Okay, so hopefully you're asking yourself, well, what types of examples are we mentioning here? Well, things like wills. So that angered lawyers. Diplomas, so that angered the educated people who were going off to college to get a diploma or degree. This angered people involved in real estate, land deeds, if you want to buy new land. And this angered, the next two just angered average citizens. Their newspapers, their playing cards, that was taxed as well. Again, probably asking this question, why does Great Britain pass the act? Well, we remember they do win the French and Indian War, but they do it at a cost. It's to raise money for the debt that they had created over that 7 to 9 years where they were fighting the French in the colonies and around the world. If you're asking now, well, why would they call it the Stamp Act if it wasn't about stamps? So let's take a picture, look at this one, and this is the way that you showed you paid the tax. They would stamp the actual document. And so this is an actual blown up image of the stamp. And if you know anything about the British government, this was their royal seal. You can sort of see it here. Okay. And in this playing card, the top of it, you could sort of lightly see the impression as well. And this was a fake one that the colonists drew up. They didn't like the idea, so this is how they reacted to it. They basically said that taxes were death. So the colonist reaction has various steps to it. So here's the first one. Okay, the first one takes place down in Virginia. You might have heard or recognized the name Patrick Henry. Well, he got the Virginia House of Burgesses to pass this resolution. A resolution is a statement of belief. And here he is in red right here, basically condemning the Stamp Act. So that's the first thing. Okay, there he is. The next thing that happened is this secret group was formed primarily up in the Massachusetts area. They were called the Sons of Liberty, and they were started by Sam Adams. And he was a real loudmouth and got people riled up. And obviously they organized in reaction to this Stamp Act. And so what they do is they boycott. And hopefully you know that boycott means you refuse to buy those things. So if those things were playing cards, they wouldn't buy them anymore. They'd keep their old ones. If they were land deeds, they'd put things off. And so boycotts and protests start to happen. But then they got really radical and they started doing these effigies. Now, effigies are these rag figures that are burned. And sometimes they actually took like the possession of a tax collector. They made like a dummy up and said that this was the tax collector, and they would burn it and beat it. In today's world, we have examples. This goes back to the George Bush presidency. This was over in Europe. They made this kind of thing. They didn't like his idea, his stance on weapons. And even Obama had some people protesting him. But you can sort of see this is actually, I believe this was either in India or Pakistan. And then current president has also had people sort of make images of him. And you even have this lawyer here sort of hitting him. So the idea of effigies is still around. Okay, this is not in America. This was in Tehran. And so everybody's sort of taking pictures of it, but you can sort of see in the background, this gives it away. But this is actually in Iran. So what do the British do? Well, they do the worst possible thing. Their colonists are rising up and complaining and destroying stuff, and they actually repealed it. Now, this word repeal means to take away. So they basically took away the thing that the colonists did not like. But then they had to put something else in its place. So we now move to the 1767 event, and that is something called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were another form of tax directly on the colonists, and they were a tax on imported goods. So we understand that imports would be things that would come from overseas, primarily Great Britain, but also parts of Europe. But they wanted to get that tax money. Please make sure you have some of these examples down of the various things that were taxed: glass, paper, paint, lead, and the one that gets everyone's attention is tea. So what do the colonists do? Well, the colonists, of course, again, they get mad, and now they have some experience, so they actually go after some of the tax collectors. That's what this guy is supposed to be. No, he's not a real-life chicken. It's actually a tax collector being attacked by the Sons of Liberty. Okay, you can sort of see the Liberty tree in the background. And no, they would not hang them, but they would put these in the trees to intimidate them. They're going to follow their old plan. So one of those plans are going to be to boycott goods. So they're not going to buy all the things that were taxed that came imported. It pushed up the idea of maybe buying some local made stuff. They also did attack tax collectors, which was bad, because when they were attacking the tax collectors, the next stage is the king has to protect them, which will lead us to our next event. So in order to protect his tax collectors, and the place that was the most problematic was Boston, what happens next is the king sends in almost 4,000 British redcoats. Now, the town of Boston only had about 16,000 people living in it. So the place was just packed with redcoats, and would bring on the most calamitous event, which we would call the Boston Massacre. Now, I want you to think about this next one, because I might even put it out as a discussion point in Canvas. Imagine in this day and age all the things that we have seen that were captured on video. How might reaction to the event of the Boston Massacre have been different if there was actually video of what actually occurred? So, what was it? Well, this is a drawing, a very famous drawing that was supposedly done by Paul Revere of the shooting of colonists by the redcoats. But this is a highly interpreted drawing. It didn't go down this way, but if you look up, you can see the actual name that they called it. They called it the Bloody Massacre, and they talked about it perpetrated on King Street, and they even give you the date. Okay, and yes, it was in the evening. So one of our first questions about how many people were killed in the Boston Massacre, many of you were shocked to know that only 5 townspeople were killed. Now, 3 of them were killed immediately. They were dead probably before they hit the ground. And then over a period of, I believe, more than a week, 2 other people succumbed to their injuries. This occurs in March 5th, 1770, in Boston. The soldiers are charged with murder, but they're actually found not guilty. And the person who actually comes to their defense is John Adams, our first vice president, second president of the United States, here he is. He was a very well-known, respected Boston lawyer. So how will the colonists reuse the death of 5 of their townspeople? Well, they're going to use it to their best advantage. And so leaders like Sam Adams would use this as propaganda. So that picture that we saw, this picture, that's propaganda. That is basically inflaming people who did not know what went down. Let's say you lived in Pennsylvania or the Carolinas, and you see this, you would assume that this is the way this event happened. And it was all to bring up anti-British sentiment or feeling. So they call for even stronger boycotts, and they call for greater resistance throughout the colonies, basically saying this had happened in Boston, but it could happen in your town. So this is actually the location of it. So maybe some of you have been up in Boston. This is the old State House. There's a new one now. But if you see this medallion out here, this is where the actual event took place. So if we bring up the picture, you can sort of see this is the same structure in both. This is a really cool kind of piece of historical information that shows you what it would have looked like in the newspaper back then. And you can actually see the names of the men right up here and their different drawings of their coffins. And kids always say, you know, why did this guy get this? I really don't know. But you could sort of see they do have some imagery of the sickle and the scythe, and they also have the hourglass. But you could sort of see and read through it. And then you can also, I just blew it up here, they had a style of printing back there for some reason that the S's here look like F's, but it's last Thursday is when this happened. And today you can go and see the burial site of those men that died at the Boston Massacre. The last event, 1773, is the Boston Tea Party. Now, Tea Party, that name does not come around for almost 75 to 100 years after the event. So nobody that was living at the time referred to it as the Boston Tea Party. That emerges over time. So what was it? Well, I think everyone's probably heard of it. It occurs December 16th, 1773 in Boston. And the Sons of Liberty, you remember those groups started by Sam Adams, well, they destroy 342 chests of tea. You're probably thinking, well, why would they do that? Well, we talked about monopolies. Remember we discussed that? Well, what had happened is the British government had basically got into business with this British East India Company, and they basically made them the sole supplier of tea to the colonies. And to basically push the tea, they decided to lower the tax on tea that was sold in the colonies. Now you have to understand that some of you got this wrong on the pre-quiz because you thought they raised the tax on tea. Well, you have to understand back in the day, and I'm going to put a picture up here. This is actually tea. If you can sort of read the lovely handwriting as I talk, they actually drank what was smuggled tea. Now today, most of the time you think of smuggled goods, you only think of drugs. But yes, back in the 1770s, they smuggled everything. They smuggled tea, they smuggled china, they smuggled spices, anything to avoid the taxes that the British government had. So there were people who basically were tea smugglers. And when they passed this monopoly on and lowered the tax, it actually made legal tea cheaper than the smuggled tea. So when it's smuggled tea is now more expensive, well, they say, well, that other tea's got to go, and let's basically say we're doing this as an action against this unfair law. So the Sons of Liberty, who were led by people like Sam Adams, and then you've also probably heard of John Hancock, this event happens December 16, 1773. One of the biggest smugglers in Boston was none other than John Hancock, the guy whose signature you see so prominent at the bottom of the Declaration. Now, I said about the Boston Massacre, you can go see the site. You can't go see the site of the Tea Party. If you see here, you see the dark part? This is the way Boston used to look. The white part is the way it looks today. That's all fill. So, you see down here? That's where the Tea Party happened. So today, the Tea Party is actually a building. And you walk by it and it says on this spot. So that's the first part of our discussion. All right?